wonderful people I met was David McReynolds. David was a radical pacifist, committed socialist, and historical figure in the United States movements promoting social justice, peace, and nonviolence. I'm reading from the program. There was a memorial service for him in New York City in September. He died at the age of 88 in August last year. I won't read all of it, but some portions. Of course, as a staff member at WRL, David was one of the primary leaders in the United States movement opposing the Vietnam War, as well as resistance to the nuclear arms race and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. For decades, David was the best-known voice of American radical pacifism and was a vital force in building a vibrant peace movement. In building this movement, David reached across the oceans to forge links with anti-war activists in Europe and Japan. David was also a leader in the Socialist Party, running for president twice as its standard bearer, and helping to build the organization by recruiting many young people into its ranks. He was the first openly gay presidential candidate in United States history, and although he never prioritized gay rights in his political work, he never hid his sexuality, even during the years when such openness was dangerous. Perhaps his greatest contribution to both movements was his unique blend of pacifism and socialism into a unified political theory that viewed both philosophies as inseparable, reflecting the same set of humanistic values. The world was richer, more flavorful, and even more hopeful with David in it. His legacy to us is to carry it on. If you want to read more about David, many of you already know a great deal, I'm sure, just Google David McReynolds, and you'll find a lot, including many of the things that were said at the time of his death. And I was privileged to call him friend. And now we move on to the special event of our evening, and that is Frida Berrigan will be bringing us a message. Frida has been very active in the War Resisters League. She was on the national committee back when I was there and up until recently. If her name seems familiar, she is the daughter of Elizabeth McAllister and Phil Berrigan, and the niece of Dan Berrigan. Her mother, by the way, is in jail in
Brunswick, Georgia.
In Brunswick, Georgia, for having participated in a protest. And she's been in jail since April of last year. And so she has a natural heritage in her family, and she's married to Patrick Sheehan Gomer, who also has a history within his family. His mother and father, Joanne Sheehan and Rick Gomer, are in charge of the War Resisters League in New England office, and very active in the peace movement for many, many years. And they too have been involved in many protests. Frida was arrested for the first time at the age of 10. So she's still at it. She currently writes for wagingnonviolence.org, a column called Little Insurrections. She is the author, as you heard. Her book is back there. It runs in the family on being, on being raised by radicals and growing into rebellious motherhood. She and Patrick have 3 children, ages 12, 5, 6, and 5. She's a graduate of Hampshire College. She worked with, for some years, with Bill Hartung. Many of you will know that name. And she will speak to us tonight on how nuclear weapons ruined my life. Let's welcome Frida Berrigan.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. Hello.
I'm gonna pretend I'm a rock star. Hold it like this. If I do this, can people hear me okay? There've been some difficulties with the microphone tonight. I've been anxiously watching everybody struggle with this confounded thing. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. I actually feel sort of superfluous of gilding the lily here by even asking me to speak after such beautiful singing and such great food and fellowship. So I brought my phone up here so I wouldn't talk until 9:30. Janet said I could talk until 9:30 if I wanted to, but I'm sure you want to get home at some point, so I'll try and keep an eye on the time. I was really delighted when I heard from Mimi and got the invitation to come and speak to you, and delighted to reconnect with Janet after all this time. And so I'm very happy to be here. I was feeling very cheeky and dramatic when I was asked for the title for this talk. So you have this sort of nuclear weapons ruined my life, and I hope they ruin yours too. So let me unpack that a little bit. I often give these talks and I just sort of barrage facts and figures and information about nuclear weapons, just the way William Hartung taught me to do all those years ago. Phil Berrigan was also quite a man for facts and figures, but I wanted to do something a little different tonight. Especially, being in front of this audience, right? You know the list of the 9 countries who possess nuclear weapons. Of course, France, China, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, besides the United States and Russia. You know that these 9 countries possess more than 14,000 warheads between them, and that the United States and Russia account for 92% of that stockpile. Right? You know all of that. You know about the nuclear weapons budget. You know about the United States' plans to upgrade and modernize U.S. Nuclear weapons arsenal to the tune of almost half a $1 trillion over the next 10 years. $500 billion over the next 10 years. Right? Of course, you all know that Donald Trump is perhaps more dangerous than other presidents in his recklessness and his overriding need to win and appear to win at all costs, but that every U.S. president since the dawn of the nuclear age has played his own part in extending the nuclear nightmare and increasing the threat of global annihilation. So I could spend 45 minutes talking about all of that, or I could talk about my favorite topic, which is my sad childhood. That's what you guys want to hear, right? But I want to tell my own story, and the story tell this story through the lens of the nuclear fire, through the lens of my relationships with people who I kind of see as the bucket brigade going up against the nuclear inferno. So nuclear weapons, for sure, without exaggeration, without kind of swooning, ruined my life. I was born April 1st, 1974. I'm about to celebrate my 45th birthday next week. It was a home birth to a nun and a priest, the beginning of many great novels. It was in the basement of a tall 3-story row house full of anti-nuclear activists. There were 15 or so people living there at the time of my birth. And in 1974, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock, and this is a sort of a trope that I'll return to throughout my talk tonight. The day of my birth, it stood at 12 minutes to nuclear midnight. 12 minutes to nuclear midnight. It had been moved back in 1972 to 12 minutes to nuclear midnight when the United States and the Soviet Union signed a big set of agreements around strategic arms reductions. But a few months after I was born, the scientists moved the clock forward, a sort of precursor of more of what was to come throughout my life thus far, to 9 minutes to nuclear midnight. And they did this in recognition, and I'm quoting from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, in recognition that our hopes for an awakening of sanity were premature. Our hopes of an awakening of sanity were premature, and the danger of nuclear doomsday is measurably greater than it was in 1972. Right? At the time Nixon was president, he was a nuclear hothead. He perfected this kind of madman form of diplomacy. It was a strategic, calculated kind of madness on his part. He told a group of congressmen around the time of my birth, I could go back into my office, make a call, 25 minutes later, millions of people will be dead. Right? This was who was president at the time of my birth. Of course, I was blissfully unaware of all this. I was a healthy baby, the first of three, born to parents who had set themselves on a course that maybe should have precluded children, right? Of robust, muscular, creative, and risky anti-nuclear resistance. And if I had read the poem that my uncle Dan Berrigan wrote to kind of celebrate my coming into the world, I might have just kind of, just gone back in, So I share this poem with you, or a little bit of it. Let's hear the poem. He wrote, "You came from Harrisburg Pit. You came from Custom House blood. You came from Catonsville fire. You came from jail. You came without regard to writs, torts, barbed wire. You came up from the least known fizz, down from Dante's crystalline paradise, a round-eyed, round-trip freeloader. You came from a nun, you came from a priest, you came from a vow. Yes and no in the great Tao that creeps." Right here. That creeps, a vine claiming like two arms the world's rack for its own dismembering and flowering. So there are no what are those things that babies get, latte? There's no latte for me. And that's the cheeriest poem of the dozen or so that he wrote on the occasion of my birth. So moving forward, March 28, 1979. It's 3 days before my 5th birthday, and the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant is in meltdown. It's in partial meltdown. And it's decades before I learned what that term means, meltdown, but the terror is real. And 3 Mile Island is less than 90 miles from where I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and my parents take my brother and I to West Virginia. We actually stay at the Alderson House of Hospitality, and I had the good fortune of meeting Bob, from that community. He wasn't there at the time, but we go there. We spend 2 weeks in West Virginia and come back to a changed diet. And this is all I really remember about it. We start drinking miso in hot water for breakfast every morning. My mother had read that the miso, which is a traditional Japanese food, the people who were working with victims of the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki drank the miso. They were able to cleanse radiation out of their bodies and strengthen their immune systems for this very, very difficult work. Miso is brown, salty, disgusting to the 5th grade, 5-year-old palate, and it's just the worst thing ever. I like it now, but I would never serve it to my own children. Maybe I should, but we drank it every morning. We drank it every morning for years, and it was sort of this drink because we live in a nuclear country, right? My parents start looking more deeply at the connections between nuclear weapons and nuclear power, right? And the 100 nuclear reactors that are across the United States that provide roughly 1/5 of the power that we all use, and how dirty and dangerous and expensive this source of power is, the radiation that it produces that we have no good way of storing or disposing. And so these things fuse for my parents and so for me. Now moving forward again, September 9th, 1980. And I had hoped Bob Smith would be here tonight from the Brandywine Peace Community. He was an unindicted co-conspirator. I think I can say that now, all these years later, without getting him into trouble. I'm 6 years old, my brother's 5, and our father and 7 others gain access to the General Electric Nuclear Missile Reentry Division in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. A few months earlier, the doomsday clock had been moved from 9 to 7 minutes to nuclear midnight. Because the United States and the Soviet Union were behaving, in the words of the scientists, like nucleoholics. My whole drive down, I practiced this word, nucleoholics. Nucleoholics. I got so excited about that word. Drunks who continue to insist that the drink being consumed is positively the last one, but can always find a good excuse for one more. Nucleoholics. So my dad and his friend hammer on 2 nose cones there in King of Prussia, and they pour blood, and they wait to be arrested. And this is a new kind of action, right? In the tradition, kind of the Catonsville 9, in the sense of entering and property destruction, but with this new twist around beating swords into plowshares, beating spears into pruning hooks. Taking personal responsibility for these weapons and symbolically transforming them from weapons of mass destruction into implements that can support and nurture life. Our dad wrote at the time, "We love our children and all children, and this is why we are in resistance. This is why we are in jail. We cannot abandon the children, cannot render them to Caesar for our immunity and comfort, and that love for them and for the God who blesses us with them will enrich their lives. So runs our hope." We, my brother and I, are in 1st grade. And even though he's a year younger than I am, we're Irish twins. We're almost exactly a year apart. It happens when you don't teach, how that works. When you're Catholic, that's what happens. So we're a year apart, and we enter school in the same grade. And so we really are kind of treated like twins. And we stay that way until 8th grade. Super fun for everybody. And then he's moved to another school. He's put back in 7th grade, and we kind of, things sort of sort out a little bit through that decision. But anyway, in the fall of 1980, we're in school for the first time. Our dad does this action right after Labor Day, and off we go to school for the first time. We're in a sea of 6-year-old politics that we don't understand. There's a lot of dynamics. We're objects of fascination and derision. We're the only white kids in our entire school. And they think we are the oddest pair of honkies they have ever seen. And we are not very well, put together. We're not very well put together children. We're grubby little children. So they're sort of fascinated by us, and we're regarded with pity by our teachers, right? They know what our father's done, and they know the details of the action. They know he's a good person. He has kind of a reputation in Baltimore. And yet, they have less context for this action than we do at 5 and 6 years old. Right, our dad spends that Christmas in jail. And just before the holiday, we go and we visit him. And my brother says to him, "I want to thank you, Dad. I want to thank you. You've given us the greatest Christmas gift anyone could." And my father says, "Well, what's that, Jer?" And he's thinking, no Christmas presents coming from this jail in rural Pennsylvania. And Jerry replies, "Well, your action, right? You're making peace just as Jesus was in coming to us at Christmas." And I have a precocious young son, and so I can imagine this kind of happening and being quite genuine. And but it becomes an oft-told story in our household, used at various times to celebrate my brother's incredible thoughtfulness and his sincerity, right? And then at other times to highlight how far we have fallen, right? You know, from that moment. It didn't get any better than that for many years, right? Our dad faces years in prison. In a February trial, he's convicted of burglary, conspiracy, criminal mischief, and he's sentenced to 5 to 10, you know, give or take, 5 to 10 years in jail. And it isn't until April of 1990, you know, when I'm 16, that they win some overturning of the charges. There's this kind of protracted appeal process, but it's all sort of, the time's all been served by that time. Not 10 years, not even 5, you know, there's time for good behavior and all of that. Somewhere between the action, the trial, and the conviction, our sister Kate is conceived. And the story goes that my mom comes home from the doctor's appointment that pronounces her pregnant and takes a slug of scotch. And she turns 42, just 2 weeks after my sister is born on November 5th, 1981. At that point, the doomsday clock is at 4 minutes to nuclear midnight, moved in January of that year in response to the flat unwillingness of either the United States or the Soviet Union to reject publicly and in all circumstances a first strike against the other country. Both sides are thinking that nuclear war is thinkable and is survivable, and in fact is winnable, right? That's the thinking that moves us, you know, to 4 minutes to nuclear midnight. So fast forwarding a little bit, November 20th, 1983. You all remember it well, right? I'm 9, my brother's 8, our sister has just turned 2. And as a general rule, we're not permitted to watch television. There's no watching TV in our house except for the nightly news. But on this random Sunday before Thanksgiving, we Berrigan children get a very special treat. And we're allowed to watch a television movie with our parents. The first time this has ever happened. And the movie is called The Day After. You guys saw this movie, right? One, it was not very good, right? And 2, you know, it basically imagines the aftermath of a nuclear attack on the United States. The lives of the people who survived, at least for a time, you know, the aftermath. I think it's centered around Kansas City. Soviet Union's main, you know, point of, you know, main concern is Kansas City, Missouri. So anyway, so after this movie, which was incredibly devastating, we sat down with our parents, and our mom told us that she was going to do an action soon. And the aim of the action would be to try and keep, you know, what we had just seen from happening in Baltimore. Okay? She later wrote of that conversation, "Our children have grown up with these nuclear realities as part of the air they breathe. They've seen many people in the community, including their mom and dad, imprisoned for resistance to nuclear annihilation. But to have mom do something like this, face her possible absence from their day-to-day lives for an indefinite period of time, this is a large step. They were willing to accept the personal sacrifice of my absence, and this is still my mom talking, as their part in trying to stop nuclear war from happening. So we talked and we shared. She writes, "It was a moment of extreme closeness for the 4 of us, a moment of accepting together whatever might come, and we concluded our conversation with prayer and with big hugs." Now, from the distance of 35, 36 years, and thinking as a parent, this whole thing strikes me as very, very calculated, very kind of, a real mom power move, you know? Give us TV, something we always wanted, no matter what, you know, was on. We watched the nightly news every night just because it was TV, you know. And then scare us and then, you know, tell us that she was going to go off to jail. That was a power play on her part. Of course, we weren't the only people who watched the movie that night. President Ronald Reagan watched it a few weeks earlier, and he wrote in his diary that the film was very effective and left me greatly depressed. Nearly 100 million people sat down and watched the movie that night, right? Back when, you know, we all watched the same thing on television, right? Raise your hand if you saw that. Raise your hand. Yeah. Maybe half this room saw this movie. Well, 100 million people sat down to watch it together. Very few of them, you know, went off like my mom and her 6 friends did a few days later. So November 24th, 1983, our mom is one of 7 who entered Griffith Air Force Base up in upstate New York. The early morning hours, it's Thanksgiving, and they hammer and pour blood on a B-52 bomber. It takes hours, you know, for anybody at the base to find them. They're all eating turkey in some hangar way far away. And they actually end up calling on the internal phone, you know, thing, being like, oh, hello. But anyway, they're initially charged with sabotage, conspiracy, destruction of government property. They face 25 years in prison. We are, as I said, 9, 8, and 2 at the time. They're eventually tried in federal court in Syracuse, and I remember their trial as a strange mix of freedom and scrutiny for my siblings and myself. Our mom and dad are caught up in the trial, and they're in there, they're distracted, and we are largely unsupervised, which is kind of awesome. We always love being unsupervised. And we're kind of left to play and grapple sort of on our own. But we're also in the media eye. And People magazine calls us troopers to the extreme. Troopers to the extreme. When they covered mom's sentencing in 1984. And our dad tells this same reporter, they don't cry. They've been raised in a resistance community. They've seen their mother and father repeatedly brought to jail for nonviolent civil disobedience. Well, we did cry. We totally cried. We didn't let our dad see us cry so much, but we did cry. Our mom ends up serving 26 months, so a little bit more than 2 years, in federal prison in Alderson, West Virginia. And we fall into a rhythm of traveling there once a month for a long weekend. Maybe about a 6-7 hour drive. I swear to you on this night here that every time we took a Friday off to go visit our mom in jail, the rest of our class went to Six Flags. Or they went to Hershey Park, or they went like camping or something. Every single time we left to go to Alderson, our whole school did something else awesome, and we missed it. Every month, our dad writes this long letter to our teachers. Please excuse my children from school letter. But with all the details of the action and how Liz is doing in jail and, you know, all this kind of information, reminding them about nuclear weapons and all of this, we bypass this and we give these letters to the secretary and we say, see you later. And they're gonna pick us up a little bit later, but fine. And we are not the only kids in our school with moms who are in jail, but we are for sure the only ones whose dad writes a monthly polemic about that experience. So these early actions and our participation in them as extreme troopers all happens at a kind of a high point of anti-nuclear opinion and activity in the United States and throughout the world. So the Clamshell Alliance is working against nuclear power. Thousands of people show up in 1977. 1 million people show up in Central Park in June of 1982. In April of 1983, 70,000 people show up, mostly women, to Greenham Common and a U.S. air base there, or a British air base that is housing nuclear weapons aimed at nuclear missiles aimed at the Soviet Union. Opposition to nuclear weapons in the United States is both broad and deep. And I definitely don't have to tell most of you about that. I'm sure everybody here can flip back through their mental date books and find one of these activist happenings that you participated in. Times you felt powerful and unified and as though we were on the edge of a tipping point, right? An edge of a tipping point into nuclear abolition, right? The time when we could kind of debate about abolition versus a freeze, right? And have kind of broad societal conversations about different tactics around the best way to get to zero. We all worked so hard for nuclear abolition, and here we still are. 5 more times throughout his life, my father carried out Plowshares actions, and he helped to organize and kind of catalyze and shepherd countless more. And I have a funny anecdote about everyone that I'm just gonna skip because I want to get to the end, and I want you all to go home before 10 o'clock tonight. But the one thing I'll say is that, as I have already said, my birthday is on April 1st. It often coincides with Easter or Good Friday, and favorite time for Plowshares actions to happen, Easter weekend. So often not often, twice, three times, my birthday present was that my father was going off to jail right around my birthday. But so I'm going to skip forward to the last Plowshares action that my father was involved in, December 19th, 1999. The action was called Plowshares versus Depleted Uranium. The group cut through a fence at the Air National Guard Base in Essex, Maryland. They poured blood, hung a rosary and a banner, and hammered on 2 A-10 Warthog planes. They were charged with malicious destruction of property and conspiracy. By this point, I'm through with college. I'm living in New York City. I have an apartment in Brooklyn. I'm working at the New School for Social Research. As Janet said, I'm working with an arms analyst and public intellectual by the name of William Hartung. And I feel really lucky and uncomfortable to be sort of paid to pay attention and paid to work on the military-industrial complex. I know all about depleted uranium, the radioactive byproduct used as a covering or ballast in munitions to give those munitions armor-busting qualities, capabilities. Some of my favorite times with my dad are sitting around and trading bad news stories. Oh, did you hear about this new weapon system? Oh, you know what they're going to try and do with the weather? They're going to make weather a weapon. Oh, well, did you know that? So we can go back and forth for hours at a time. Super fun. He is reading and enjoying the many articles that I'm writing and publishing, and it's gratifying to be able to send these to my father. He occasionally enjoins me to not have such a secular voice. No, just put a little quote by Jesus into that article. You know what I'm not hearing? I'm not hearing any gospel in this article for In These Times magazine. And I'm like, well, maybe I'll quote Gandhi or something, but I'm not quoting Jesus for the progressive dad. So, we're trading all these stories about depleted uranium and everything, and so I know something's up. I know something's being planned. And I come down from New York City, I take the bus down to Baltimore specifically to question him and to say, come on, seriously? That was my plan. I had it all worked out. And we sit down together, and it all falls apart. I can't possibly ask this man not to do the thing that he's planning on doing. He wrote a statement before the action. He says, "I am 76 years old, a married Catholic priest, with 35 years of resistance to the Empire's wars, 9 years of imprisonment, numberless arrests, surveillance, dirty tricks by the FBI. Enter my friends." Kindly, he did not say my daughter. "Enter my friends, sometimes brusquely. Hey, dads, give it up to the young pups. It's rocking chair time." He did love his rocking chair. There are definitely no rocking chairs in jail. Not even in federal prison. But, he continues, "I cannot forget the dying children in Iraq. 2 million Iraqis dead from our war, sanctions, and depleted uranium. I cannot forget my country's war psychosis, its obsession with better tools for killing, its mammoth war chest, its think tanks, and war labs." For this action, my dad is sentenced to 30 months in jail. Right, so you do the math. A little bit more than 2 years, right? They were prepared for the worst, my mom said, outside the courthouse afterwards, and they got it. My dad served some of his sentence at a youth facility in rural Maryland, which was hilarious. Right? He's the only white person there, rural Maryland, most of the young men were from Washington, D.C. He's the only white person, even all of the COs are black. And he is 76, 77 years old. The young men are very solicitous, very respectful. They call him Pops, but like in a nice way. And the visiting room, I have this vivid memory. It had like a kind of, if you're sitting down, it had sort of almost a shoulder level barrier up, between you and the inmates. And so you couldn't sit straight. There was nowhere to put your knees. It was very loud, so you had to kind of sit sideways, right, and kind of visit like this. You see what I mean? And then he's here, but you couldn't put your hand on the barrier, right? You could touch at the beginning, you could touch at the end, but there's this kind of constant like, I don't know what to do with my body while I'm visiting you. The visits were half an hour, so, you kind of, anyway. After September 11th, 2001, he was moved, he was in solitary for about 3 weeks. Feel free to ask me about that in the Q&A. The announcement about silencing your cell phones was not made at the beginning of this event tonight. Yeah, feel free to do it now. It's not too late, I still got 45 more minutes. But after he's released from solitary confinement, after September 11th, he was moved to a jail in Ohio. A more age-appropriate environment for him. And we visited there as often as we could. He was released right before Christmas of 2001. And friends welcomed him back to minimum security. Hey Phil, welcome back to minimum security. He died less than a year later, on December 6, 2002. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist Doomsday Clock stood at 9 minutes to nuclear midnight, the same time it was when it was created in 1947. In the wake of September 11th, the scientists wrote, "Moving the clock's hands at this time reflects our growing concern that the international community has hit the snooze button rather than respond to the alarm. More than 31,000 nuclear weapons are still maintained by the 8 known nuclear powers." Excuse me, I think at that point, North Korea was not yet an acknowledged nuclear weapons state, a decrease of only 3,000 since 1998. So after most of the next decade and a half, after our father's death, our mom continues to live in community. She continues to bear witness at the Pentagon, the White House, other sites of power. She keeps animals, something my father never would have approved of, goats, llamas, donkeys. She starts watercoloring again. She does beautiful art. She's arrested repeatedly, but not in any, not in any big actions. I leave New York City for a small town in eastern Connecticut. I get married, I have 3 kids. My brother and sister also settled down. My brother also has 3 kids. He lives at a Catholic worker community in Michigan. My sister is the only doctor of our generation, and she's a doctor of physical therapy. She's very talented, lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're all arrested occasionally, but kind of like our mom, not for anything too big. We march, we organize, we speak, we try, right? We try. As our mother approaches and passes 70, we, like many sort of ageist people, start encouraging her to take it easy. Give up the rigors of community life, we said. Stop doing so much hosting. It's like she runs a hotel for activists, right? She's always picking people up at the bus station. Constant demonstrating. She's still sleeping on the floor of churches in Washington, D.C. on her little mat, right? So we beg her to give this up. We envision her, and in fact we invite her to live a life with her grandkids, these 6 marvelous individuals that we've created. Stories, bedtimes, sporting events, art projects, can all be yours, Liz McAllister, we say. She goes, you guys surprised by this? Oh, Janet told you already. So. She ruined the whole arc of my talk at the beginning. She goes in the exact opposite direction, right? As a good resistor would, right? And with others taking the reins at Jonah House, she feels free. She feels free for the first time since our father's death to be a Plowshares activist again, to conspire with her friends and plan for a rigorous and daring action. We don't know the specifics, or else we would be in jail with her. But as all of her answers about the future kind of muddle into a very specific, very familiar kind of vagueness, we know exactly what's going on. And we all get on the same page and we say, come on, please don't. You're too old, we say. I actually got in trouble for describing her as elderly in a talk not too long ago. So she's not elderly, but we did say she was too old. Think of your grandkids, we said. I will, she says. I'm not too old. And I am thinking of my grandkids, she says to us. This is what I have to give, she says to us. I'm really harping on my birthday here, can you tell? Kind of anxious about being halfway to 90, right? Which is what's gonna happen on Monday. So on April 1st of last year, I turned 44. It was Easter, again. And a few days later, we received word of a new Plowshares action. So on April 4th, 2018, 7 Plowshares activists, all identifying as Catholic, entered the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in St. Mary's, Georgia. They went to make real the prophet Isaiah's command to beat swords into plowshares. They chose to act on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. They really wanted to lift up his identification of the triple evils of militarism, materialism, and racism. Carrying hammers and body blow, it's time for some more water. Carrying hammers and baby bottles of their own blood, they attempted to convert these weapons of mass destruction, these Trident submarines, there at Kings Bay. They were charged with 3 federal felonies and 1 misdemeanor, and they could face 25 years in prison if convicted on all counts. And they were hauled off to a local jail that same day, and 3 of them, my mother, Father Steve Kelly, who's a Jesuit priest, and our friend Mark Koval, who's a Catholic worker from New Haven, Connecticut, are all still there, right? Still in county jail almost a year later. They still do not have a trial date. The 4 others are out on bond. They're wearing ankle monitors and required to check in with their minders at regular intervals. And while this is kind of like a prison of the mind and a prison of technology, they're not earning, they won't get credit for it as time served, whereas my mom, and the others will. So she has opted to stay in jail. She didn't want to submit in this way to monitoring and the ankle thing and all. Kings Bay Naval Station is home to 6 nuclear ballistic missile submarines. Each carries 20 Trident thermonuclear weapons. Each of these weapons contains 4 or more individual warheads, right? To understand the massive destructive power of these weapons, each one of these is 100 kilotons. Right? Each one is 100 kilotons. And the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima is a 15 kiloton weapon, right? This is many, many times over, just on one submarine, the killing power of Hiroshima. For those of us who have seen those pictures and sort of born witness is inconceivable power, inconceivable destructive power. My mother feels quite useful in jail. She is generous and empathetic and calm in a place that encourages none of these qualities. The wheels of justice grind very slowly in Georgia, particularly because the activists are mounting a creative legal defense. They're seeking to portray their actions as protected under the freedom of religion, using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, right? And this is a piece of legislation that's been used to quite ill effect by the Hobby Lobby, by the homophobic cake maker, and so they're trying to mount this kind of novel legal strategy, in part because if they don't, the courts are very good at shutting down any kind of discussion of nuclear weapons, of conscience, of anything other than the very specifics of the crime. And if you strip away the intent and the motivation and the desires that brought people to this, well then, honestly, it's just kind of mess making, very expensive mess making, right? Which is what the federal government wants to portray it as, of course. This RFRA kind of thing has never been used in a criminal case. The rest of the cases have been civil cases, and so this is all just moving very, very slowly. And I'm often impatient, and I have to remember that, my mother is not impatient, right? She's very kind of zen down there in this place where she eats canned food and doesn't go outside, and can only communicate by weekly 15-minute phone calls that cost about $4 a piece, and then little postcards. So we communicate, we try and get it all into 15-minute phone calls and little 4x5 postcards. So please keep the Kings Bay Plowshares in thought and in prayer. I have information, I didn't print a lot of copies of it, but I have information on how to write them. And then also in the back, they're trying to be very modern and very social media savvy, so there's some signs in the back. I stand with the Kings Bay Plowshares. You can take a picture and hashtag it somehow, and it will sort of speak to the breadth of support for their actions. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So we're coming to the end. You guys still awake? Just a few months before they acted, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the clock, this time to 2 minutes to nuclear midnight. They said, this is a dangerous time, but it is a danger of our own making. And isn't it? Right? Humankind invented the implements of the apocalypse, and it can invent the methods of controlling and eventually dismantling that. The doomsday clock has never been closer to nuclear midnight in my lifetime than 2 minutes. And in fact, it hasn't been closer, it's been there one other time in 1953. So we can look for signs of hope. The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons is certainly one sign of hope, and this kind of new consensus happening outside of the traditional ways that treaties are negotiated and ratified within the Security Council, right? So this is an exciting thing that the global community is a part of. ECAN won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for that work, and I think we can collectively think of many other signs of hope as sort of a bulwark against the despair that one can feel looking particularly at the nuclear weapons issue. Never mind sort of trying to embrace global climate change and the whole other host of issues and concerns that this LEPOCO community works so hard on. So in conclusion, I'll just say nuclear weapons did ruin my life. Right? I am never not thinking about them. Nuclear weapons are present in my most mundane tasks. They're present in all of my major relationships. Every goodbye and hello is freighted with a small sort of friction of uncertainty. Small, but there nonetheless. Nuclear weapons have shaped how I think about time. I often think of Jonathan Schell's beautiful book-length essay about the gift of time, right? He called it the gift of time that we were given at the end of the Cold War, that we emerged from that global conflagration still more or less intact. And we had been given the gift of time. And I think sometimes, well, were we worthy of that gift? Right? But nuclear weapons have caused me to honor and treasure the present. They have made the future provisional, muted, and not taken for granted, which is a troubling way to try and be a parent. Right? I try and be present to the present and hold the future loosely. Hold the future loosely, but with hope. Nuclear weapons ruined my life, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And in fact, I hope they're ruining your life too. Because that is the only way we are going to get rid of it.